Yeah, well, good evening and welcome to the Simi Network Right Conference 2020, which, as you know, has become Right Online. My name is Lewis. I think I've met everyone actually here who's here at the moment. I'm one of the staff of the Simi Network. And it's right tonight that we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we're meeting. That's a little bit more complicated tonight because we're meeting on lots of different lands around Australia. In fact, not even all in Australia. There are people from overseas here tonight. So that is a little bit complicated, but God, the creator, in his wisdom and love, first gave the land, at least where I'm sitting, to the Tharawal people. And so as we meet together from across the country and indeed around the world, we acknowledge and pay our respects to their elders and the elders of the peoples local to each one of you as well. In fact, you could even pop names of local clans and tribes into the chat if you'd like. We can all enjoy that.
Very generous of you, Lewis, to assume that we can all
but
do that.
we certainly do pray that the God who made all the nations will ultimately unite all of the peoples in Jesus Christ to his glory, the glory of the one who has loved every nation and people and tribe by sending his son Jesus to die and rise again, might be reconciled to him. Amen. Now, quick introduction to the Simi Network. Apologies to those for whom this is the third go around, but the Simi Network is a ministry of the Australian Fellowship of Evangelical Students. We're a network of Christians working in academia, from postgrad students to postdocs and professors and professional staff. And now in the time it takes a postgrad to cook a nutritious dinner of 2-minute noodles, let me give you a brief insight into what makes us tick. Life in the Simi Network is lived kind of in a way answer to 3 questions. I'm just gonna share my screen so that we can, oh boy, yep. So that we can see those questions up here. So the first question is about campus. How can I be an ambassador for Christ on campus to my friends, my group members, collaborators, office mates, and the wider university community? The second
not
question
seeing the screen, Lewis, if you're intending to share the screen.
Oh, you can't see it. Okay, all right. Right, that
there we go.
Is better. Thank you. Okay, right. So the first one's about campus. I won't repeat that. The second one is church and society. How can I use the opportunities and expertise I've been given to equip God's church for its mission in the world? And the third question is about the world. How can I use the qualifications I've been given to support the work of Christ outside of Australia, especially in regions where God's people are poorly resourced and where the name of Christ is not yet honored? So that's us in a nutshell. Join us if you dare. Our Right Conference is one of the ways we answer question number 2, really, primarily about equipping the church. But tonight, I think you're really going to get actually a lot of 1 and 3 as well. So buckle your seatbelts, and it should be actually quite, very interesting tonight. Now, there's one thing coming up in our calendar, our annual SITE conference, which is our theology and missions conference at the end of the year that we run in conjunction with the undergrad's national training event. And to this year, it's going to be a 2-day online affair, Monday and Tuesday, the 7th and 8th of December. But I'm told that our Rego page is going to go live this week, by the end of this week. So stay tuned. You'll get emails to direct you to that. Now I'm going to read a few verses from 1 Peter 3, 1 Peter chapter 3, which seems appropriate for our kind of semi-apologetic view of the world tonight. And then I'll pray and I'll introduce our moderator and then turn it over to him. So 1 Peter 3, verses 8 to 18. Here we go. Finally, all of you live in harmony with one another. Be sympathetic, love as brothers, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult, but with blessing, because to this you are called, so that you may inherit a blessing. Whoever would love life and see good days must keep his tongue from evil and his lips from deceitful speech. He must turn from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. So who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear what they fear. Do not be frightened. But in your heart, set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. It is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. For Christ died for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive by the Spirit. Now join with me in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, in your great mercy, you have given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. We praise you for the hope we have that shapes every day of our lives and allows us to respond to the trials of life in ways that surprise our friends and family and workmates. Prepare each of us to give an account of that hope to all who ask, and by your Spirit, may many turn to you in repentance and faith. And now we pray, use your servants tonight to challenge and instruct and inspire us to think clearly about your world and about our lives in them, so that we may live well, loving you and loving our neighbor for your glory. In the name of Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. Now, our host for the evening is Lachlan Brown. Lachlan has been in Wagga Wagga since 2011 at CSU. He grew up in Macquarie Fields, which is where I am sitting right now, in Southwest Sydney, completed his PhD at the University of Sydney. 2008, he was a recipient of the Martin Travelling Bequest for Poetry, and in 2013, he received an Emerging Writers Grant. Now, he's won the Sydney University Henry Lawson Poetry Prize and the Hermes Best Poem Award, but the most cherished prize, I am sure, in his trophy case, nearest to his heart, is the Macquarie Fields Poetry Prize. I'm sure you can look that up somewhere on Google. Lachlan has been shortlisted for all sorts of prizes, including the Blake Poetry Prize, and Neil, you'll be glad to know the Newcastle Poetry Prize as well. Commended for others. He's regularly invited to lecture and give readings at writers' festivals around the country. And I believe he said he's also the last academic standing in English at Wagga Wagga at the moment. So he's an endangered species, our Lachlan Brown. Thanks so much for hosting our evening tonight. Lachlan, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lewis. Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm in Wagga and just looking at the sun setting over the hills out of my window, and the birds are flying over, flocks of cockatoos and galahs here in Wiradjuri country. So I wanted to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which I'm coming to you this evening. And look, it's really exciting to think about the topics that we're going to think about tonight. We're going to hear from Jennifer Nicholson and Lauren Bryant. Some conversations about, when I was looking at them, I was thinking, sometimes when we think about teaching and research, I don't know about you, but often the institutional stances and the language around things like teaching leaves it a little bit impoverished, leaves it a little bit technically focused, removes the human element. We had a student evaluation survey that removed questions about, was my teacher any good? Like, there was no learning from the teacher involved, but it did mention, did I learn from my peers? And so the university, I think, is quick to remove humanity and perhaps remove those particular aspects like values. And so I'm really interested in those moments that Jennifer might share with us that have happened in her classes and where faith can be brought to bear, and in particular her Christian faith. And also we're going to hear from Lauren Bryant and coming at it from the research side and archaeological research in particular, and specific locations, and how that can facilitate, again, this perhaps a different view of the human and humanity. And how that might lead to certain conversations. So really, it's really fantastic to have you all with us, and I think we're really blessed to have Jennifer and Lauren with us. two really thoughtful academics. So we're going to start by, I'd like to, and by the way, we're recording this, if you've seen up on the left-hand side of the screen. So if you don't want to be recorded, I don't know what you do. Don't turn your,
tell me later.
Yeah, that's right. And if you would like to ask questions at any point, you can pop those in the chat. Lewis and I will moderate those. We'll have each paper, and then we'll have some time for questions after each paper, and then we'll have a little bit of time at the end. So yeah, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jennifer Nicholson to you. Jennifer is a sessional academic who's been teaching at the University of Sydney in literary and interdisciplinary studies, teaching film, genre, and early modern literature. She researches from the early modern period into the 21st century with a focus on the various edges of the English language in a range of literary forms, which is really exciting for me. Her projects currently span Shakespeare studies, particularly Hamlet, Montaigne, early modern drama, Renaissance books, untranslatability, theology, and desire. So a real gamut and spectrum of things that you can ask her about. Primarily an early modernist, Jennifer's primary area of interest is currently the presence of French and French English in early modern playtexts. She's currently also working on a longer project concerning the English language versions of films produced by Japanese animation company Studio Ghibli. I just left my kids at home to come into the office watching Spirited Away for the first time, and I was kind of watching them as they watched it. So I'm excited by that as well, Jennifer. Jennifer has work forthcoming and recently published in edited collections spanning from early modern drama to Anglophone translations of Japanese film. She tweets about her work, so follow her on Twitter. She tweets about her cat, so follow her cat on Twitter. No, follow her on Twitter, and other general interests. You can find her at Just Generally, JUSTGENERALLY. So I'll hand over to you now, Jennifer, and really looking forward to what you have to say to us. Thanks.
Thanks, Lachlan, and thanks everyone for coming. Just if you could bear with me while I share my screen, that would be fantastic, and I'll get going in a tick. Just got to get back to page 1 of these slides. Here we go. All right, so in due course, we should have a PowerPoint slide on screen. I think I just got a thumbs up. Probably means you can see it. Fantastic, fantastic. I've spent many an hour on Zoom teaching this semester, and I'm still not loving it, but that's okay. So just bear with me, sorry. Today back in March, I had anticipated that I might give a paper that I'd already written on something that I was already working on. I had a pretty busy year, I thought, coming up, and I thought I wouldn't have time to write anything new. I thought I wouldn't have anything specific to write about. And I was meant to be going to another conference immediately after Write in Canberra. And so I thought, oh, I'll write something, I'll reuse something that I've already written. And then I actually looked at the conference sort of suggestions, the prompts, and thought, oh, maybe I should write something about teaching work rather than sort of the research that I do. And then this year happened, and so here we are now. These reflections are probably more applicable to this year. The nature of my teaching this year has been quite different, but I think they would apply were they to come up in my year or in future years. So what I'm hoping is that this paper will give you some insight into how I'm often sharing or discussing either Christianity or faith more generally in the lessons that I teach. I'm hoping to sort of show some of the ways that I might try to navigate that respectfully, but with a healthy dose of sort of challenging the atheist status quo that I might often find in the classroom. So I'll first establish briefly the kind of teaching work that I do, just so you know what I'm talking about, and then briefly mention my PhD project, as that sort of has influenced what I tend to work on. And then I'll dive into some examples, just examples of how Christianity and other major faiths, and just thinking about faith, have a tendency to crop up when I'm teaching. So firstly, just to give you an idea of what I'm working on normally. Sorry, this is all gone a bit funny. First year of my PhD was 2016, so I only finished last year. I did a bit of marking and exam proctoring, but I was really just trying to get my head around what my PhD would be about. I did think a little bit about my interest in early modern texts, and so I had decided that I wanted to write on Hamlet, and I quickly settled on 2 different French sources that were, apologies, that were going to be integral to my work. So that these are 2 pages of them down the side if you're interested. The essays of Michel de Montaigne and the French language version of the Latin edition of a Danish folktale, which is about the prince Hamlet, who is the eventually the influence for Shakespeare's play. So these are the 2 texts I was reading. I wasn't thinking much about teaching until the following year, where I was asked to teach in the undergraduate Shakespeare subject. And I also taught introductory film studies that year. The following year I did, as you can see, some work on playwright Christopher Marlowe, who was at the same time as Shakespeare. And we'll come back to him because he's important. But I also did a little bit of teaching in world literature and rhetoric. 2019, I did a lot of repetition of some stuff I'd taught before. And also genre studies came into the mix, and that repeated this year as well. And there's some interdisciplinary stuff in there amongst it all. But you can see in general, what I'm tending to be doing is either literary studies or some kind of textual study. And so what I'm tending to do is leading students in how to interpret, what you might do with different kinds of texts, how you might offer an interpretation of them. So that's my kind of teaching identity, I suppose. And I found over the last few years, there are of course plenty of ways to integrate my faith into my teaching in the way that I would integrate my faith into my work. That would apply regardless of my job, I think. But I've been much more taken with the way that my field often actually requires at least a basic knowledge of, certainly of major world faiths, but often just of the ideas that surround things like faith as a reason to act. Often this comes up in the kinds of texts that I'm teaching. In early modern literature in particular, a pretty reasonable understanding of Christianity is very useful. Basic biblical literacy is very useful, and knowledge of, say, the Reformation and its impacts on London in the year 1600 and surrounding times is very useful. And that's often what is coming up in plays by Shakespeare and Marlowe, both of which I've had to teach. So I've been really interested in the way that encouraging students to think about faith actually helps them both understand the text, but maybe reflect a little more on how faith might kind of translate into the contemporary world. I think for a lot of them, if they aren't already in a world of faith in some way, they may not really think about how it applies nowadays. They tend to very heavily historicize it. But I find by bringing it into discussions about why does this character act this way, or how do you understand this scene to play out, that really helps them. My task as a teacher, I feel, is to be quite direct about any relevant knowledge. So for me, that includes stuff about faith, and I'm not sorry about that when I bring it up in the classroom, but I do often mention to students, this may not be something you know about, or it might be something you know lots about, and I try to be quite equalizing in how that comes up. And then from there, we run with it and we see what happens. So the connections you might already kind of anticipate between early modern literature that I've sort of mentioned briefly would have occurred to me at some point in high school. I don't remember when, but if you read a Shakespearean play when you have any kind of biblical literacy, you'll quite quickly spot references. You don't need to be a Shakespeare scholar to spot them if you've read bits of the Bible. Certain parts are quite obviously referencing other things. Let me give you just an example of that kind of thing, and I'll talk a little bit about sort of what you might do with this. So in Hamlet, to go back to the play that I've read too many times recently, the prince, Hamlet, has the ghost of his father appear to him, and the ghost orders him to avenge the ghost's murder by Hamlet's uncle, Claudius. And in one of his speeches, Hamlet describes his conundrum. He says that he's being prompted to revenge by heaven and hell. Now, he's prompted by heaven, more likely meaning the heavens or the powers that be or God, only because at a different point, the ghost specifically mentions that it's coming from purgatory, not heaven. So if you'd recognize that at some point in the scene, even if you have no particular biblical knowledge, you might notice or realize that heaven may not mean heaven in the sky, beautiful place. Either way, the spirit is in purgatory, but is in some way from heaven or the heavens. But Hamlet's also saying, well, I'm being prompted by hell. And this is because the play, obviously, at several points, locates itself in a Protestant understanding of faith. The Church of England, at around the time that Hamlet was quite popular, discounted both ghosts and purgatory as possible. So these things were Catholic and not allowed, I suppose, by the state. And so if, according to Protestants, ghosts say don't exist, then whatever has appeared to Hamlet is not a ghost of his father, but something else uncanny, a devil or a spirit that's trying to lead him astray. Now, when I was teaching a text like Hamlet, and when I'm teaching most undergraduate subjects, my classroom is usually 20-something students whose knowledge of Christianity or faith might range from absolutely none to leads a Bible study every week on campus. It really could be any kind of student in the room. I do find the demographic breakdown of our department is such that many of the students either have been to church as a child or have been to a church school. So they often have some basic ideas of who Jesus is meant to be, that God might exist. They don't necessarily have much working knowledge of faith if it's not their own, or if they haven't been raised in a family that has taught them more detail or something like that. So when I offer my proverbial classroom of students a sentence like this one about heaven and hell, if they don't have any details about Protestant England, for example, they can still understand the play. They can still understand this line. They can get the gist, right? Heaven and hell are clearly opposites. They clearly mean good and bad in some way. Hamlet spends a lot of the play stressing about what he should or he shouldn't be doing, thinking about why he should or shouldn't be doing something. The ghost is often played, or at least interpreted by students at face value, in a way that might be a little bit creepy, but not necessarily obviously good or bad. So they have an understanding of the general meaning of why Hamlet is stressed about the decision, and that this might be something odd about the ghost that is worth reflecting on. But if they know about the Protestant Catholic back and forth, if they know about the beliefs behind this, and also if they know about other historical features like the prevalence of revenge as a kind of plot device at the time. It's not just religious stuff, but this kind of contextual material is often really important for understanding these plays. For me, teaching this line or lines like it would, yes, help the student understand something historical about the context that would help them understand, but it also just gives them another tool in their set of kind of possible options. So I find that if I introduce faith and I introduce this and I introduce that, they have three ways of going about offering an interpretation. They're more likely to have a more complex, detailed understanding, or they can have a good go at offering a new one. If I only offer them one or two, and if I discount faith, I really think I'm doing a disservice to a text like this one, which is so full of lines like this one. So this is the kind of thing that is in basically any reading I might set for a student. And so this is kind of the sort of thing I'm grappling with. I want to turn sort of for the next couple of minutes just to specific examples of what this has looked like, particular examples of students asking questions or situations that have come up, which I hope demonstrates a bit more of why I think it's important to bring up the specifics of faith. So I've already given you one example from Shakespeare, so you only get one more. But one short teaching moment, I had a student ask me, she showed me this passage from towards the end of the play Hamlet, and she said, why is Hamlet talking about sparrows? She had no idea why Hamlet was talking about sparrows. So at this point, Hamlet is about to go and duel Laertes, another character, and his friend Horatio suspects that it's likely that something suspicious is gonna happen, and this is Hamlet's reply. Now the student understood that Hamlet knew, oh, this situation is out of my control. She could work that out, even with relatively basic understanding of how to read this kind of thing, but she had no idea about the sparrows, which is not a clue. Now, you might recognize this as being a reference to something like, Matthew 10. This is the King James, so that's the closest that Shakespeare would have recognized probably out of the ones I could find easily. So in context, We have a not two sparrows sold for a penny, or a farthing, as it probably would have been for Shakespeare. But this sense that sparrows being connected to providence, it hadn't occurred to me that she wouldn't realize that this was a connection. I hadn't mentioned it, I hadn't put it down in my notes. She was just reading this section of the play. So in this instance, biblical knowledge is, I would say, purely additional insight. It doesn't give her a tool in the scene that is going to change the interpretation of the scene dramatically, but it does just help her to get a better grasp on how is Shakespeare using language, how is the scene being presented to us. And in a play like Hamlet, where there are lots of, say, animal images and animal metaphors, it's another one of those for her to recognize and maybe think about. So I could have perhaps just said, oh, it's a biblical reference, and maybe told her that and moved on. But I think it was, one, it would have been a bit reductive to do that. And two, it wouldn't have taught her to investigate and research possibilities like a reference to another text. So I told her it was a reference to another text. I pointed her to the other text and I said, you might want to look out for this kind of thing in the footnotes or in your own reading. So that's one instance. In a different early modern, but no less interesting and possibly more interesting text to teach, would be Marlowe's The Massacre at Paris. Now, I've mentioned Christopher Marlowe earlier. I taught a subject that covered all of his plays and sections of all his poems, and he's fantastic to teach because he writes about the three most exciting things I get to teach about: death, sex, and faith, all in the one play, usually every time. So this is mostly about death and faith. Sorry, no sex in these ones, but you know, got to keep it as interesting as we can. In Massacre, the title might suggest to you the play is about a massacre in Paris. It's based on the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. So French Calvinist Protestants were massacres by a Catholic, a organized group of Catholics. They were known as the Huguenots. And in Marlowe's era in London, there were, of course, plenty of these French Huguenots who had fled in a few waves across. So many of the French people or French heritage people in Marlowe's audience would have been there as a result of this and other similar events. More interesting to me, though, was the fact that when I was reading this play, I recognized that Marlowe took an example of religious conflict, which was a specific conflict between Protestant and Catholic groups, but he made it about something more than that. So the leader of the massacre, the Duke of Guise, appears to be this kind of militant Catholic organizer, historic figure, but Marlowe writes him up as extremely hypocritical, and sort of either an implied atheist or someone who is merely using religion to his own advantage, not because of his own convictions in that faith. So this is part of the speech that he gives towards the beginning that introduces you to his character. And he says in the middle there, "My policy hath framed religion. Religion, a devil," basically. So this kind of take on religion, this very caustic kind of approach to it, is something that Marlowe does in a lot of his plays, but it's often done in relation to religious hypocrisy. So this and other sequences in Massacre are a really valuable opportunity to read and consider, what did religious violence look like at this time or around this time? Does it look like what we recognize as religious violence now? Is it the same? Why or why isn't it? It also helped us, we considered, well, are these accusations of hypocrisy correct accusations? Is this character really being hypocritical, or is there a misunderstanding about what they believe? This play is, contrary to its subject matter, very funny. So we looked a lot about how Marlowe pokes fun at different kinds of religious beliefs or practices, and then talked about the ways in which some of those might be actual accusations of hypocrisy versus sort of specifically dramatized misrepresentations of a conflict. So actual disagreements between religious groups being played up as hypocrisy instead of as a disagreement about faith. When the students didn't know which one was which, we would find out. We would go and read the Bible passage we thought was being referred to, or we would read another text from the same time period that might give us a hint one way or the other. Another instance of Marlowe, just because I like him, you get two examples. The very opening of another play called The Jew of Malta has a Machiavel figure who is a prologue. So he introduces the characters, introduces the setting, and he actually gives a sermon on atheism. that's the opening speech, is a sermon on atheism, immediately launching into a play that's a lot, again, about religious hypocrisy. So in this opening speech, he says, "I count religion but a childish toy, and hold there is no sin but ignorance." The play basically caricatures Jewish and Christian, Maltese and Turkish believers of different kind of persuasions. Usually they're fighting over gold. And the play is notably racist and anti-Semitic. So it's a very difficult text, but its message about the disjunction between faith and action is really interesting. And the students found, once we could establish, yes, there are parts to this play, the ways that it thinks and writes about people that we wouldn't consider okay now, we could still address that, and then also consider, what does this teach us about the context? What does this teach us about Marlowe's concern with hypocrisy and so on? I did find that, again, we could test parts of the students' knowledge and the way that the play works by saying, okay, this character is suggesting that this other character is being hypocritical or is working against their belief in some way. And so we would test that idea. It was part of how we got our way through the plot of the play, which is a bit confusing. And then also, without some knowledge of the religious background of the play, it's almost impossible to understand some of the back and forth, because a lot of the repartee is referencing scripture or kind of cultural elements. So it was important for understanding, and it was important for extending our understanding of the play. Now, the last thing I just wanted to mention before I kind of finish up is that this kind of stuff comes up in everything I teach. It doesn't seem to matter what text I'm teaching, what subject I'm meant to be teaching. There are often things that come up where I will feel prompted to, or it seems only obvious to, speak specifically to aspects of belief and faith. So these are just two examples. I'm not going to go into them in any detail, but to give you a brief idea, the Jazz Singer is noteworthy for its technical elements. It was in the film studies unit that I taught, basically because it has some of the first synchronized sound recording. So it's at the point where silent films are just stopping and sound talkies are basically about to begin. But it has a very unproblematized, extensive depiction of blackface and a very simplified representation of Jewish identity, both of which are very difficult topics to navigate. I actually had a young Orthodox Jewish woman in my class that semester. We were watching this film, and so navigating that discussion with her and with other students was really important, but quite difficult. But the film was made by a largely Jewish cast and production team. So it was also really interesting to consider, why was this made? Why is this being problematized and this not? What does this teach us about X, Y, and Z? The other text there is a play that is, as you can probably guess, an adaptation of Hamlet, and it sets itself in an unspecified Arab country. That's literally, it's like, that's the description in the play, an unspecified Arab Muslim country. And it basically, it depicts Hamlet becoming radicalized in the way that he responds to his father's murder and so on. It was really necessary when lecturing on this to differentiate this text with Shakespeare's, but also point students to the ways in which things like faith and politics are not easily separated. It doesn't matter what idealized version of those things you might have, they don't separate easily. And neither Hamlet nor this adaptation attempt to separate them out. And so it's always been interesting to me that many of the texts that I'm teaching, whether I've set them or not, I'm almost never setting my own text list, or whether the topics that we're covering are strictly relevant, often this kind of material comes up for me. So to kind of tie things all together, I suppose for me as a teacher in any setting in the university space, I found that thinking with students about faith and about belief has been really productive. Whether that's students who have a faith and see themselves in some way in a text, whether that's students who don't know anything about it but recognize its significance for a character or a scene, or whether it's just a wider part of the contextual material required to understand that text. I found that encouraging students to leave their maybe what I often find to be kind of general derision or dismissiveness about it at the door, and say, what is it to consider this seriously in the way that you would consider another element of history or context significantly? has been really helpful and productive for them. And also they teach me lots about how to think about faith and how to teach it. So that's my reflection on teaching and faith. Thanks very much for coming.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Fantastic. And we've got so many questions that are coming through the chat. I might begin with a question, as perhaps as my prerogative as chair, to ask about when as an English a teacher of text, that you point people particularly to the biblical text. There's a sense in which I think was it Ken Gelder who speaks about the novel Elizabeth Costello by Coetzee, and the Bible is just another book on the shelf, and the Bible just gets pulled out in the same way as the other books. Is there a sense in which in the classroom now, like how do you like we can pull out allusions and references everywhere, but there's a flatness to the plane because everyone's got the same smartphone that they're looking up in the same Google that they're finding this, and so what they're retrieving doesn't have the context perhaps, or the weight, or the that you know, those of us with a particular faith might ascribe to that text, and of course the writers, you know, like Shakespeare who's writing Hamlet might have. I mean, how have you found that, and how have you negotiated that kind of that flatness, that general flattening of all text into the one great elusive thing?
The like multi-text that's just out there.
Yeah, the Library of Babel.
Yeah.
As Borghead would say.
I think for both, say, the Shakespeare and the Marlowe subjects, because I was with the same group of students focusing on that author for the entire semester, this kind of conversation talking about, oh, that's a biblical reference, or what does faith have to do with this, is an extended one rather than just a 10-minute segment of a class. So I think that does help in that if I keep bringing that up and this historical event and that additional text or what have you, it's more of a gradual collaborative, let's expand the additional stuff that we have surrounding the text that helps us understand it. So I think there's a bit of that. I think, I know for the Marlowe subject, the nature of that was that I coordinated and then I taught about a third of the classes. So then 2 others taught the other 2/3 respectively. So we had different kind of focal points each. And part of what I did, partially just because I was also introducing the unit at the beginning, was that I set the scene of early modern London as a place of like religious conflict and religious struggle and what have you. That was part of how I established the historical scene. Partially because I knew it would be useful for reading those 2 plays, among others, because Marlowe is kind of obsessed with religious people killing each other. That's sort of his vibe. So I wanted to set that up early so that we had a bit of time to build up some of that knowledge, so that when we got to something like the Jew of Malta, we already had a bit of stuff to work with. But I also think it would really depend on the specific reference being pulled out. Sometimes it is just a reference, I think, in that the Bible was so much of a part of early modern culture that you would put in a reference because you thought of it. I think, you know, it's not like every reference is in there to convert you. That's not really the point of the religious material in something like Shakespeare. I do think that the nature of some of the references seems more extended or repeats throughout a play, or is like really like done to death in one scene or something, just in case you missed it the first time. And so, like recognizing any reference or allusion to something, when it's more extended or in more depth or seems to be repeated a few times, you might pay it a bit more attention. So the sparrows thing is a good example of, it really is just a reference. Like if Shakespeare hadn't mentioned sparrows there, if that part wasn't there, it wouldn't really matter to that speech, that text, I don't think. But there are several extended discussions of heaven and hell and ghosts and purgatory and what have you. That's a really key concern of the play. And frankly, it reflects a historical concern at the time with how do we really think about the dead? How do we really think about what happens after we die? So even if the students aren't engaged with that as something that they personally care about, it's something that comes up in many of the plays, something that's really helpful for them to then go away and interpret a different section or another play from the same time period. So yeah, I think it's, some of it is extended work, thinking about the value of a biblical reference, and some of it is recognizing when it is or isn't maybe so important to point out.
Thanks so much. I might throw to Liam's Professor Liam Sembler's question now. I'm happy for you to read that or to ask it, Liam, if you'd like. It'd be great to hear another voice.
Okay, thanks, Lachlan. Thanks very much, and thanks, Jennifer. It's terrific to hear you talk about what you do. I think in a way you kind of answered my question just by your talk, but it just occurs to me as we notice students coming through university with decreasing knowledge of biblical, well, even theological ideas and biblical texts and biblical stories.
Yeah.
That is this, that is coincident with their illiteracy about a lot of things that are occurring in our historical literature. And so, in a way, our role, if we're teaching literary studies, shifts a little bit in that space, I think, where we have perhaps more to give and more interesting options to present material that we can no longer assume people know anything about. I mean, examples would include the Garden of Eden, where people are fundamentally ignorant now in comparison to the way you could make certain assumptions about ideas to do with, say, original sin or the fall or something. A lot of it has to be explained now. But on the upside, students who do the arts and do philosophy or literature, they're kind of predisposed to be interested in the ideas.
Yes.
And that's really interesting too. So I was just wondering about your reaction to that, but in a way you kind of were speaking to that anyway. So thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I was really interested, particularly when I taught the Marlowe subject, which was Liam's fault or generosity, depending on which way you want to think about it. So thanks, Liam. But that course, there were people who wrote really excellent, maybe not super biblical, not super like religiously, textually literate, or not necessarily really competent around the ideas, but really genuinely interested in, say, the Catholic Protestant ongoing argument. And so they wrote their essay on the Jew of Malta, or they wrote their essay on Massacre at Paris, and really tried to work out what is going on here with this idea of forgiveness, or what is going on here with this idea of sin. These students who had professed to me 5 weeks earlier that they were an atheist and didn't know anything about church. So that to me was just really valuable, because I think it's important for understanding the text. I think it's important, if you're doing a degree where you read literature, that you have some understanding of the faith and values that are going to inform the people who've written what you're reading, that's going to help you understand it. And obviously for me as a Christian, I think it's fantastic that they've heard this stuff somewhere. But it's also, yeah, as you say, I think you also have students who aren't interested at all and still kind of begrudgingly recognize that it's useful for interpreting the text, which I think is also really nice to kind of watch that happen, because I think it's to differing degrees useful or not useful for the specific thing. But I think often I bring it up and often it becomes productive, and students mention that it's a different take or something that's helping them understand. So I'm happy about that too, even if they're not getting, super schooled on the Garden of Eden or whatever. Yeah.
One thing I thought was that, and just in having taught teaching students for a little bit now, perhaps we're at a generation, just to follow on from Lewis's point, that the teachers who are teaching canon are themselves biblically not that literate. I mean, I'm not speaking for all the. So the first time the students will encounter these texts like Hamlet, they're not taught by a baby boomer necessarily who went to Sunday school. Even now, they could be taught by a 22-year-old who's just fresh out of uni, who hasn't been schooled in this at all. And these are the ones that we've seen go through. So we're at that kind of generational level. I wanted to perhaps combine a couple of questions. Lewis has asked about whether you're typical in your field in pointing people to external texts. I mean, how is your teaching practice? Is this a typical thing? And I just wanted to, Graham McLean, who's here in Wagga as well, has asked, he says, Jennifer, what you've described seems to me to be a straightforward description of fine teaching. But I'm intrigued as to why it should be regarded as in any way exceptional or problematic, or even, and he doesn't mean this in any deflationary way, as newsworthy. So for a lot of us, I mean, for some people it might, this kind of chasing up of references, this kind of inhabiting the thought world of a text is teaching in that sense. And I'm thinking as well, Graham McLean has got these great stories about teaching philosophy and teaching which parable is it? The Good Samaritan. Graham teaches the Good Samaritan, and fewer and fewer of his students know anything about the Good Samaritan. So that's kind of where he's coming from as well. But I wonder if, could you perhaps respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't think it's very unusual for a Christian teacher. Or I don't think it should be unusual for a Christian teacher. I think maybe that's where I stand on that, in that I think I have spoken to a fair number of Christian academics and Christian teachers who don't seem to think about this, and I always think that's kind of odd. But I think, I was thinking more, and I wasn't sure what the audience would be for this either, but I was thinking more in terms of, how can I reflect on and talk about what I do. It's partially not distinct, I think, for someone like me overall, in that, as I said, the early modern stuff is so connected with religious material in various ways that you have to know some things about it. The person we had lecturing for the Shakespeare unit, both times I taught it, did lots of material, spoke lots about, some of the reflections on how people understood death and how that changed, and religious impacts on the history and the play and all this kind of stuff. It's important, but there is, in some areas and for some students, a shift away from a historicized reading and more of a shift towards just, I'm just going to interpret this. And obviously part of that is a hangover from our high school system in New South Wales, at least. And so part of it is working against that and saying, well, no, you can't make an argument out of anything unless you have material with which to make that argument, whatever that looks like. And so I think part of it is, this is my particular way of kind of steering away from that, because it's something that I know well. And so I feel more kind of equipped to teach this kind of thing. But also, it does raise the occasional interesting feedback from a student where they say, oh, we spent a lot of time talking about religion. That was kind of weird. And so I think that in itself is interesting, that that's feedback that comes up. They don't necessarily, I don't think I've ever had a student say specifically that they thought something was wrong with that, but it really stood out to them as something that was a bit strange or a bit unusual. And so that to me was a sign that, well, clearly none of their other teachers are doing that. So I'm happy that at least I was doing that. But I suppose it also depends on the kinds of subjects that students are taking. If you've got a student that's mostly doing not early modern stuff, they're less likely to have texts that are more embedded in that kind of thing. So I hope that
Thanks,
kind of answers
Jennifer.
the question.
Yeah, thanks. I might ask one more before we move on to the next presentation, and I might try and combine, and we can come back to these if we've got a little bit of time at the end. So I'm sorry if we've missed your question. We'll try and get there. But maybe, so Lewis's second question and Lauren have both asked. I mean, Lauren asks, you mentioned that as a teacher, you feel it's part of your role to be direct with students about knowledge relevant to what they're studying. Do you feel this gives you a lot of freedom to be open about your own faith, as well as the nature and role of faith? So on one hand, you've got the nature and role of the faith in the text generally, but then you've got your own faith, which in the classroom, that's an interesting thing. And at different points, we want to reveal little things and withhold. I remember Neil at a conference once saying that in his opening slide, he says, this is me and this is the things I do. And part of it is my involvement in this, in a church. And so we're always negotiating that. And Lewis has asked whether kind of this has opened up opportunities to guide other, maybe students or other people through particular external text on which we're more of an expert. So have you got any sort of stories or thoughts about that?
I do think, in answer to Lauren's question, to kind of go from Lauren's to Lewis's, I mean, I feel no kind of hesitating kind of feelings towards sharing it as it's relevant. I do think it's the kind of thing that could become something that could actually be less helpful if it was like a really driving force in the classroom, because I think it would push back some students who are not engaged, not interested in that from the outset. And so I think it would really depend on how you read your classroom and the kind of dynamic you have and the kind of relationship you have with your students and things like that. So I think there is a bit of possibility you could maybe swing too far the other way depending on where you're at. But yes, I mean, I do think it gives me a lot of freedom. And I think, because I'm often teaching stuff that is so relevant, it's not a stretch for students to understand why I'm doing it. They might be confused about how much, but there's an initial connection, and then I'm drawing that out further because I think it's important. But in terms of, sorry, just going back to Lewis's thing, don't know if it's necessarily opened up opportunities with non-Christian teachers, or if it has, I don't know about them. So it's possible that it has, but I have no idea, is the short answer. But the longer answer is that I have done a little bit. And so there was a chapter in my thesis that was on kind of Montaigne and Hamlet's various thoughts on friendship. And I tied that into how Paul talks about like Christian partnership, koinonia stuff. And that was, I only wrote that chapter because I'm a Christian, and I happened to notice a connection and went, I'm going to write 6,000, 8,000 words on this. And it was also something I was already interested in, but I wouldn't have written it, I don't think, and I wouldn't have been as engaged in how Paul writes and then been able to write a chapter like that if I wasn't already interested. But that chapter, I gave a version of that at a conference and had 4 or 5 conversations with people about why I'd written it and what was kind of noteworthy to me, what had stood out, and so on. And so that was still a really productive kind of paper to write and conversation to have with that group of people, even though I'm not really sure where they stand. But yeah, yes, it has, but maybe not so much in the teaching realm, so much as the research stuff. Yeah.
Well, it's great to see where those things lead and where they can be leading or be led. So thanks so much, Jennifer. I hope we'll get some time at the end to kind of continue. So there's a couple of other great questions if you want to take a look in the chat. But I want to introduce Lauren Bryant now, who'll be presenting for us as well, from all the way from Adelaide in South Australia. So Lauren's completed a Masters of Archaeology and Heritage Management at Flinders University. She's currently dividing her time between being a research assistant involved with the Queensland Native Mounted Police Archaeological Project and an apprentice staff worker with the AFES, both at Flinders, both of those roles at Flinders University. So it's really great to have her with us, and she'll be speaking on, I think, 2 different archaeological projects and what they've meant as a researcher for her. So thanks so much, Lauren. Great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. I will share my slides and hopefully that will go smoothly as well. Perfect. And I promise that even though this is an archaeological research presentation, it won't degenerate just into slides of places I dug up on my holidays. It will be focusing on research. So I'll go ahead with that. So in my very brief time in my career in archaeology, I have always seen it as seeking to understand the past, not just as an academic exercise, but this is really about understanding where humanity has come from and what lessons we can take from that. So in my own research as a Christian, I've seen my research in archaeology and my worldview interacting in this as my faith and my research have mutually influenced one another. And as mentioned, there are 2 projects particularly where I see that, where I've been involved, and I'm going to speak and just reflect a little bit on those 2 projects and how I've seen my faith and my research interacting in those 2 different situations. So the first of these was what I did my master's research on, which was the Willow Court Asylum archaeological project, which was looking at a collection of artifacts from a mental asylum in Tasmania. And the second project was an international collaboration taking place in Central Asia, which was investigating the history of the East Syriac Church in Central Asia by excavating a Christian cemetery there. And both of these projects, which involved very different research teams and were in very different research contexts in different countries even, both still demonstrated to me how my own Christian worldview and theology influences the research that I do, and how the research that I'm doing also influences and challenges me to think deeply about faith. And I think another aspect of this is the way that this shows the importance of research to provide practical outcomes in society as well. As for both of these projects, there were important practical outcomes. For the first, it was raising awareness of mental illness, and for the second, providing a platform for apologetics for believers who are living in this Central Asian Republic. Archaeology particularly has the power to challenge mainstream historical narratives and to empower minorities who are often not represented in the historical record, but can be represented in archaeological sites and in the artifacts that we find there. So my specialization is historical archaeology, particularly, which explores the material record of often colonial contexts and the interaction between written sources and the archaeological record in these areas. And one practitioner particularly described that as aiming to recover the active voice of the silent majorities. That is, all of those people who were present in history but have no representation in the historical record, sorry. So I believe that this is an aim that aligns well with the biblical mandate to love our neighbors. And this particularly focuses on those in our society who have been ignored and had their voices removed in the historical record. By recognizing the marginalization of these sections of society in the past as they are excluded or misrepresented in historical records for various reasons, archaeologists can contribute to the representation of those groups in the present. However, there are many groups that still remain underrepresented in archaeological and historical research and in discussion in our society. And one example of this is people who have lived with mental illness. So research at the Willow Court Asylum, which is located in New Norfolk in Tasmania, attempted to address this by exploring the potential of artifacts to provide information about the daily lives of patients confined in these kinds of institutional contexts. And this was a type of research that hadn't previously been done by archaeologists at asylums because there was a perceived difficulty around understanding what artifacts mean when they are coming from asylum contexts. So one significant Australian archaeologist has stated, hopefully my slides are working here, artifacts when found do not always represent choices made by the individual living and working in the institution, but rather choices made by those administering the institution. For most institutions, an alternative pathway has to be developed to allow us to understand the world of the institution and what life was like for both inmates and staff. The solution or alternative pathway for most researchers was simply to consider the architecture of asylum buildings, ignoring the fact that these can also only represent the perspective of those administering and designing these institutions. And people have tended to ignore artifacts and therefore missed a lot of information that could have been provided about the lives of people who were actually living in these asylums in the past. This area continues to need further research, as it's only now that we're beginning to explore the potential of this. But the immense significance of the collection I was looking at from Willow Court for research is not only that it was an undisturbed collection, but that it can be seen uniquely as the result of patient behaviours as this patient interacted with the asylum control systems. So this is really a unique archaeological find, which provided a way for methodology to be developed to understand both this site and asylums more broadly. This is the building, which is still standing, as you can see. And this is where the collection that I was examining came from. What made the existence of this collection particularly peculiar is that these objects were deposited intentionally by a patient residing in this building during the Second World War period and hoarded in an underfloor space within this veranda. And the only known access point to this veranda space at that time was a trapdoor in the floor of the veranda that you can see there that opens onto a approximately 1 meter drop to an underfloor space that is just compacted dirt that's under the veranda on the building. So this patient would enter this space and then create intentional mounds of objects and that they had collected from around the asylum, from their own possessions and from the possessions of others. And this was happening over a period of multiple years with multiple depositional acts happening to create this hoard in this very private space, which presumably only this patient was aware of. As I said, it's very unusual, and very unusually for an archaeological collection wasn't actually buried, but was just concealed. Unfortunately, I can't go into too much detail of exactly what I found and all of the wonderful historical detail of this site. You'll have to ask me lots of questions if you would like to know more about that. But I will highlight briefly the particularly significant and unusual aspects of this collection to give you a snapshot of the results of this project and what we found there. So for the objects themselves, though they were very diverse in what they included, they were dominated by, so there you can see the underfloor space as well, not very comfortable. But the collection itself was dominated by ephemeral items, which made up 75% of the 440 objects I studied. These were paper-based, everyday common items, including pages torn out from newspapers or magazines, packaging from food or other items, and letters and envelopes, which were addressed to multiple different individuals who were in the asylum at that time. As you can see here, there were also fabric items present in the collection, which is unusual in itself, as fabric and paper are rarely present in the archaeological record. And particularly unique in the fabric objects, you can see the very discolored piece of fabric on the right has embroidery on it. This particular piece, even though you can't see it clearly from the photo due to the deterioration of the piece, is embroidered with the names Bach, Mozart, and Schubert. And there were many other embroidery pieces that were embroidered with words or names or images that we believe the patient was copying from objects she found around the asylum. I was also very fortunate in having newspaper artifacts, which made dating my collection very easy. So you can see this is an example of a newspaper page from the Second World War period depicting Stalin's Far East from August 16th, 1941. The final aspect of this collection, which was the most fascinating and archaeologically unique, was the presence of these packages and parcels. So these were compound objects created by the individual accumulating these materials by taking multiple individual objects such as newspaper pages, feathers, fabric, or food packaging, and folding or rolling these objects together, sometimes then containing them by tying them with a strip of fabric in order to create a new discrete object, which was an object in itself. And the significance of these packages and parcels, which have not been found at any other known archaeological sites, I'll explore in a minute as I discuss more how my own Christian worldview interacted with this research project as I was looking at it. So as Jennifer has already explored in her talk, as Christian researchers, our worldview underlies everything we do and our understandings of the world around us. And this particularly, for me, impacts on the way we understand the nature of humanity. And as archaeology is the study of the objects that humans leave behind, this has a particular impact on the research I do there. I think particularly in this project, this impacted the way I viewed the individuals that I was studying and looking at their lives. So we would know that in Genesis, we are described as humans as the image bearers of God. And though this image is imperfect as a result of sin, all humans are deserving of respect and dignity. For many patients in these kinds of asylums, during their own lifetimes, this dignity was stripped from them as they were denied a voice to tell their own stories, denied access to the wider world, denied a lot of their agency, and dehumanized by doctors and other staff, as well as often their own families. Patients were classified according to their gender and social status alone in many cases, and doctors' case notes from the hospital present a grim picture with patients being reduced to a series of symptoms or simply described according to the perceived likelihood of their recovery. The descriptions of patients by doctors depict them as hopeless in most cases and devalued them and their actions and the choices that they were making. In contrast to this, a researcher who examined a similar case study in America looked at one particular tea towel, which had been embroidered by a patient in an American health facility in the 1960s, and stated that a few instances were present that might reveal symptoms characteristic of schizophrenia, such as indistinguishable concepts and minor disorganization, but they are comparatively few. Music and emotion of all types dominate this piece of embroidery, and elements of the embroidery reveal a sense of person, place, and time. It is a reminder that patients should be viewed first as individual human beings. Diagnoses do not define the individual. Restoring a voice to patients who have been in these kinds of institutions and representing their stories with respect is essential to provide them with the dignity they were often denied in life. And this is an attitude which clearly researchers are moving towards in this field, and one which fits within my own Christian worldview. So I am glad that that is the case. The above case, along with the packages and parcels and the other embroideries that were found in the Ladies' Cottage collection, also reveal another significant point, which I found interesting as I looked at this research, which was the significance of creation as an interpretable transmission of identity. As we reflect the image of God, we are also creative beings and create things from the materials that we have around us. And often that communicates aspects of our own identity, though it would be easy to simply view the behaviors of this patient in creating this hoard as a manifestation of her symptoms, of her own struggle with mental illness. My own research into psychological studies and conditions such as hoarding disorder led me to the opposite conclusion, that rather than being the result of symptoms of mental illness, the creation of this hoard was an intentional act by this patient through repeated ritualistic deposition to create and preserve her own identity by exercising her own agency. And this is something that has been seen at facilities like this around the world and in modern contexts as well. Creating objects was significant for this patient as a way to preserve her own identity by creating this hoard and this collection, by creating the embroideries that she did, where she had materials available. And this hoard then functioned as a time capsule for her own identity, created from the very limited objects she had available to her in the asylum. For me, this view was informed by my own theology and understanding of creation and the way we view creating in the Bible, but it also challenged me to think more deeply about identity and how it is communicated. My own faith and research interacted throughout this project as I came to a deeper understanding of the need to allocate all people dignity in research, even if they do exist only in the past, and to understand the significance of humanity as made in the image of God and how this affects how we understand human identity and how we view objects as well. The second project that I wish to discuss, as I mentioned, was the Central Asian Research Project. And due to the sensitive nature of this project, I will be sparing with the details in some of the particulars of this. But with this project, I was involved with a primarily Christian team of researchers and volunteers to investigate church history, as mentioned, through the excavation of a Christian cemetery, or believed to be Christian burials. This aimed to engage with local communities to convey to them the realities of the history of the church in this region, in contrast to popular understandings and national narratives of cultural identity, which are closely associated with Islam. The history of the early church in the Central Asian republics has not been researched in great detail, particularly archaeologically. There are many reasons for this. However, the collaboration between a local archaeological firm and a US university to work at the cemetery site for the past 4 years has allowed this research to expand. Unpublished research by the excavation team has outlined that the presence of Christians in this area was identified in 2014 upon the discovery of what was identified as a large kairak, which is a stone grave marker, which was decorated with an engraved cross. Since 2016, surveying and excavation have been undertaken at the site to identify the location of the cemetery and recover a number of other hierarchs, some of these being either engraved with crosses or with inscriptions in Syriac, some of which referred specifically to believers being buried at this site. The focus of the most recent excavation season was specifically to excavate adult graves in order to retrieve samples for osteological and DNA analysis and investigate the grave structures, including the presence of any grave goods with these burials, though this has been seen to be rare in Christian burials in this area. There were a number of aims for this excavation, centering around exploring the cultural entanglement present here, as there are uniquely Central Asian cultural features such as grave constructions, which are combined with Christian traditions such as the use of biblical names and the Syriac language. Investigating this cultural entanglement by understanding grave constructions and the ethnicity of individuals through DNA analysis aim to understand whether these individuals were local converted believers or members of a migrant population, to challenge a lot of skepticism of the existence of a historic local church and a community of local believers in this region. One significant conclusion from this, which corresponded with finds from previous years, was the simple fact that all of the burials excavated and identified followed a west-east orientation, which is quite different to Muslim burials in this region. One particularly significant find from this site, which has been described in a currently unpublished report by a member of this dig team, were grave goods discovered in one grave that was excavated by myself as a part of this project, which included 2 silver bracelets, 2 beaded bracelets, and 4 rings from a female individual excavated at this site. And what was most significant about this find was not solely the presence of these grave goods or how beautiful they look now that they've been cleaned up, but also that in contrast to the many unfurnished burials at this site, we found these grave goods engraved with a symbol that has been identified as the 4-petal rosette, which can particularly be seen on the 2 bracelets and one of the rings. So this has been identified by researchers as a Christian symbol which acted as an optical illusion to conceal the presence of a cross. So you can see from the example here, on the left, you see this image of the leaves, and on the right, the negative space between the leaves actually forms the cross, which was kind of concealed in a way that allowed believers to communicate their faith, but also conceal it from those who they might not want to know that they were followers of Jesus. This symbol can be found in other explicitly Christian contexts, such as this example from a Christian basilica in Armenia, and researchers propose that the identification of this symbol at this site provides strong evidence that these individuals were believers, and significantly, this can be provenance to an undisturbed grave context and assigned to a specific individual, whereas the hierarchs discovered could not be assigned, in most cases, to specific graves due to heavy disturbance in the upper levels of the soil due to Soviet farming practices. This symbol was also recognized by local archaeologists who were part of the team as one they have found at other sites locally, suggesting further avenues for research now that the symbol and its meaning have been identified. Other data from this excavation is still being analysed by the dig team in order to investigate what this reveals about this site and community, and pending DNA analysis, these results will be published soon. This investigation is significant in a very real way to local believing populations where conversion to Christianity is often seen as a betrayal of Central Asian identity, and sometimes as a betrayal and submission to a colonial power, as Christianity in this region is often associated with Russian Orthodoxy, with the many historical and political associations that has for local people, many of whom lived through the Soviet period. Speaking to local believers revealed that conversion often leads to ostracism by family and friends, or in more extreme circumstances, threats against their own safety. Publicly available evidence to show the existence of a legacy of a local church in this region would be very significant for local believers, both in justifying their own faith and giving them an opportunity to share their faith with others. Throughout the Bible, we see that God's people take their identity from their understanding of their own history and their collective memory and identity as God's people. So here in Joshua chapter 24, the people answered, "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord to serve other gods. It was the Lord our God himself who brought us and our parents up out of Egypt from that land of slavery and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey and among all the nations through which we traveled, and the Lord drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites who lived in the land. We too will serve the Lord because he is our God." The history that Israel knew of being God's people and of God loving and saving them is what motivated them to serve him. And I think this is just one thing that highlights how important history is in informing the identity of individuals and groups. Investigating history through archaeology allows us to gain this understanding of where we come from, which can help inform our identities and will be particularly important for the Central Asian Church in this entire region and will give legitimacy to the church in this area, as well as providing, as in the title of my talk, a significant platform for apologetics so that these believers can defend their faith in what can be a quite hostile context. This was a project I was very privileged to participate in, and I'm looking forward enthusiastically to seeing the conclusions that they publish once this is collated and finalized under the team that's continuing to work there. Throughout this presentation, I've mentioned these different examples where I can see my faith interacting with my own academic research in these understandings of the significance of creation for humans as creatures made in the image of God, the importance of contributing to the lives of those who are marginalized in society, in understanding the importance of restoring dignity to people who are unable to do this for themselves by giving them a voice, and in the importance of revealing truth in contrast to popular understandings of identity. And despite the differences in the teams I've worked in, both of these projects I can see as being equally influenced by my own values as these flowed from my faith. Both had different practical outcomes, all of which I see as of great value for society. Bringing greater awareness of mental illnesses and the experiences of those who have lived with this is an important aspect of social justice, which I see as significant for myself in helping restore dignity to my neighbours as people who are loved by God. And fortunately, as some practical outcomes of this research, I was able to be interviewed by ABC Drive in Hobart and contribute to an ABC News online article that was talking about this project as well, and understandings of mental illness in the past and how that impacts on the present. And I also consider myself privileged to be able to be involved in this project, which is investigating the history of the Christian faith in a country that is now Muslim and rapidly westernizing this entire region, because this is significant to help believers defend and share their own faith and have the resources to do this in the public sphere, as well as in conversations with friends and neighbors and family. There are many ways to see the impact of faith on research and allow research to deepen understandings of faith. And these are simply some examples that I've seen from my own field of research, but hopefully ones that have been interesting and beneficial for you to hear about.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Just really fascinating and just amazing research. And we have so many questions, and I might throw to Gordon if he's still here to ask you a question about exhumation and archaeology, because it's got a couple of upvotes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. That was amazing. It's always inspiring to see a Christian take their love of God in all sorts of different directions. Yeah, I just had a question. I met someone when I was recently on sabbatical in England, in Oxford, who was a archaeologist, and she told me about the debate about exhuming people, whether that's consistent with their dignity, whether they would have wished that on themselves, or the family had wished that on themselves, or whether it's a little flourish of, as they might see it, immortality. I don't know. How do you come to terms with it, or what do you think about exhumation?
Yes, you are correct. This is a debate. And yes, archaeologists have been arguing about this since they were first excavating people or things, and they continue to debate it today. The morality surrounding excavating and displaying human remains is a question that is still discussed at all kinds of levels of academia. And yeah, there are particular questions around that when it involves First Nations peoples as well, and respect for the wishes of particularly Indigenous communities in Australia. For myself, this was a question that I've thought about, but after discussion with those who are running this dig, their wish is to have these remains inhumed again once they have been researched at the same site, and hope to have some educational materials there so that information can be provided at this site, hopefully, about those who were buried there and the significance of this research and the findings that have been made. In this case, the only way to get DNA samples, which the best DNA samples come from teeth, does involve excavating these graves. And yeah, the questions that the team wants to answer around whether this was a migrant population or a local population, which is significant for the local people. If this was a migrant population, the research would have less significance and would hold up less to questioning in terms of their kind of apologetic response. If it was a local population of believers, that's very significant for them. So those kinds of questions can really only be examined through osteological and DNA analysis. And another kind of research area that they're hoping to go down is, so these is believed to be from, I believe it's the 12th, 13th, 14th century kind of time period, which is significant in that this was when the Christian faith began to disappear in this region for a significant amount of time before it was reintroduced. So looking at the human remains in order to see if that can tell us anything about why this happened is particularly significant, because it has been believed for a long time that plague, or the disease that moved across to Europe and became the plague, was a significant factor in wiping out the Christian population and the Christian faith in these regions. So if that can be shown to be the case, that would be significant for research as well. And again, that really requires us to look at the human remains, which is difficult and must be done sensitively in any kind of excavation, but was something that the team decided was essential for the research they were doing. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you. That's great.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I might ask Graham if he'd like to ask his question. He says he's got a rather wordy question. We've got 4 minutes left, Graham. Do you want to try it about the first project that Lauren shared with us?
Sure. Well, thanks, Lachlan. You can apply the reins as moderator. Lauren, thanks very much. Really fascinating to hear all about that. I was just, you may need to correct me if I was getting the wrong impression about what you were saying about your work on the artifacts from the mental home, but I took it that you were tending to say that those more personal artifacts you as archaeologists could discover, motivated by your own worldview about the dignity of those folk, was able to give you a more rounded picture than of those folk than might have been, now this may be the bit I've got wrong, than might have been the view of them by those caring for them in the mental home, as represented by things like patient notes and diagnoses and so on. Now, if that's the tendency of what you want to say, I want to challenge that, because it seems to me in danger of drawing unduly large consequences from what are, in your case, literally and metaphorically, fragmentary bits of evidence. I think of my own case. I've been undergoing various medical things lately, hospital and GP and various specialists. And in my obsessive way, I ask for copies of all their notes and reports and whatnot. And those notes and reports are always typically, and indeed inevitably, very, very cryptic. But I know very well that they don't give a full picture of how wonderfully I'm being cared for by all the people, both writing those notes and in the teams of those treating me. So the cryptic nature of the diagnosis seems to me no good evidence that somebody is not being treated as with the utmost dignity, and perhaps in a way that's thoroughly governed, as in my case, by people operating with a wonderful Christian worldview and attitude to my significance. So I'd throw that out as a challenge.
Yeah, I'm definitely happy to respond to that. And yes, I in no way wanted to imply that the care given in the New Norfolk Hospital in the various different phases that it went through was subpar. In fact, even historical research, which has looked at the asylum, has found that they were at the forefront of pioneering practices like music therapy. So they were definitely looking for options to increase patient well-being, and many of the staff, I'm sure, had a great care for patients. And even there have been memoirs written by staff who worked at the asylum that show that all of their actions were genuinely motivated by wanting to care for patients. And as you said, when we look at doctors' notes, these are fragmentary, as is the archaeological record in itself, that we only have preserved a small fraction of what existed at the time. So both of these, we can be misled if we're not careful in interpreting them. But certainly when we look at doctors' notes, they still betray a very different attitude towards mental health from what we see today. So in the way that patients were viewed, and when we look at the New Norfolk Asylum complex is very, well, it's very complex. There were, I think at the peak, almost 30 or 40 different buildings as part of this, which were all used to house different types of patients. So male and female were separated, and then patients who were of different social classes were separated, and patients that were viewed as being violent were separated as well. So it's a complicated facility, and the treatment varied across that as well. In terms of my own worldview and how that interacts with my research, I think that both because of my worldview as a Christian and probably because of my context, my own historical context, I have a very different understanding of mental health to the doctors who were treating patients at this time. So when I look back at the case notes, they can be very, as I think the word I used in my presentation was grim, that these mental health was viewed as something for often it was viewed as something for which there was no help or cure. And often there were misdiagnoses. So when we look at the population statistics for the asylum, it is very likely that a lot of the people who were in there, just based on age, were suffering from things such as dementia, which were treated in a way that we would definitely not deal with those individuals currently. So yeah, I believe that my worldview does influence the way that I view these patients and interact with these records, but there are also a lot of other complicated elements that come into that as well. And the New Norfolk Asylum was definitely, by the standards of its own day, was pioneering in a lot of research areas, and was, I believe, the asylum itself was only closed in 2001. So it continued operating for a very long time and cared for a great number of patients. And that is definitely good work that should be commended. And yeah, did you have anything you'd like to come back with from that?
Well, yes, I would, but I think Lachlan's going to exercise his chairmanly authority and shut me up quite rightly. But if we're allowed to stay on afterwards and chat, that'd be great. But I'm in Lachlan's hands.
I think Lewis may have, in his ghostly way, said he could leave it open for a bit. I might call us to a close, but I wanted to thank both our presenters for two really fascinating papers, and that theme of care, I think, came across in both of them. This really deep concern for the teacherly relationship and the texts, but also the care in the methods. I mean, it's not was it Neil who spoke about he was ready for the bullwhip, but of course the way that Lauren showed us how her archaeological practice works, it was just deeply dignified. The presentation of those artifacts involves so much care that came out from of this worldview of this really rich and deep view of humanity as created in God's image. So I wanted to thank both our presenters and everyone for their questions, and I'm sorry for those questions we didn't get to. And I'll just ask Lewis if he wants to tell us anything about the upcoming events that he might have before we close.
Thanks, Lachlan. But really just to say, clear the 7th and 8th of December in your diary, and you'll get notification at the end of the week of the opening of the Regos. We got a great program. So yeah, that's it really. Thanks for